Well, open your Bibles to Revelation chapter 3. Revelation chapter 3, as we continue our study through the book of Revelation, as we're here trudging our way through the second portion of this book, chapters 2 and 3, where John is writing down the things that Jesus is speaking to the 7 churches in Asia about. And this all goes back again to Revelation chapter 1, verse 19, where Jesus told John to write the things which are, which is chapter 1, and the things which you have seen, that's chapter 1, and then the things which are, that's chapter 2. The things that are concerning the things of the church, both in John's time, throughout church history, and even to us today, to us now. And as we learned Sunday, and we've learned in previous studies, that Jesus tells us, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches, plural. So all these words to all these churches apply to believers everywhere in all churches at all times. And so that's why we are studying them, and we need to study them. So tonight we pick up in verse 7 as we begin our look and our study at the 6th church that Jesus writes a letter to. And here in chapter 3, that is to the church in Philadelphia. So what we're going to do tonight is we are going to look at the history of the church of Philadelphia and look at the history of the city of Philadelphia. And when we do, then that will put together for you and help you make sense of a lot of stuff that Jesus says in this letter to the church, okay? And so what's interesting is Jesus is sending these letters to these churches. The climate, the environment that these churches find themselves in the cities they're in, and the cultures they're in, have a lot to do with their church and with what Jesus says to them. And so you'll see that very clearly tonight. So I want you to look at verse 7, and that is all we'll look at tonight, is just the very first part of verse 7. And then next Wednesday, we will pick up looking at the rest of this letter verse by verse. And I can tell you already, before we even start this letter, that after we just spent time looking at Jesus' words to the church at Sardis, okay, as rough and tough as that letter was, this letter to the church of Philadelphia is a big sigh of relief. It's a big breath of fresh air. Because who he's writing to here, the believers he's writing to here in Philadelphia, are believers who are faithful. These are faithful believers. And so his letter to the church of Philadelphia here is to the faithful church, as opposed to his last letter to the dead church. So you can imagine Jesus' words to a faithful church are going to be much different than they were to a dead church. And so as we go through this letter, I can confidently tell you that you will be very much encouraged, and this will be a little easier sailing through this letter than what the last one was, okay? So, verse 7, it simply says, "And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia." And so, again, as we've mentioned many times, the angel here, most likely speaking about the pastor of the church. And so Jesus has some encouraging words to say to the church of Philadelphia here. Now, one thing I'll point out right from the get-go is this is the second of only 2 churches that Jesus has nothing to say to them in the way of a word of correction or condemnation. Jesus has nothing negative to say to this church or about them. And that's what sets them apart from the other churches. It was only the church at Smyrna back in chapter 2 and the church of Philadelphia here in chapter 3 that Jesus had no words of condemnation for or correction for. So again, that's a good thing. That's a great thing. Now, sad to say, before we end this chapter and we end this section, we're going to have to look at Jesus' words to the church at Laodicea. And with that church, just like the church in Sardis, Jesus has nothing good to say to them. He has no words of commendation to say to that church. But before we get there, At least we have this reprieve here in the middle of two churches that he had much to say to in a way of correction. In the middle here we have, again, like a sigh of relief, a breath of fresh air with his letter to the Church of Philadelphia. So let me give you a little history about the Church of Philadelphia. Now, we have a map. If we could go ahead and put the map up, so that way you can kind of keep track of where these churches are at. So what we've looked at so far in chapters 2 and 3 is we began in chapter 2 with the church of Ephesus. Then we went north and looked at Jesus' words to the church at Smyrna. Farther north, Pergamos, Thyatira. We just finished here in chapter 3 with Sardis, and now we're at Philadelphia. And so that's where the Church of Philadelphia was located. The city of Philadelphia, there in the Roman province of Asia, of course, is western or a little southwest in the modern-day country of Turkey, or at that time it was Asia Minor. So the city of Philadelphia was founded around 189 BC by the Pergamon king Eumenes II. And in honor of his brother Attalus, whom he loved very much, when he established this city, he named it after him. In fact, the word Philadelphia is a compound word in the Greek. That means it's two Greek words put together. And the two Greek words that make up this name, or this word Philadelphia, is number one, the Greek word philos. This is where we get the word philosophy. The word philos is one of the biblical words, New Testament words in Greek for love. Okay, for love. And so the word philosophy literally is the love of wisdom. So here, the word philos means love. And the Greek word adelphos, that's the word for brother. And so when you take those two Greek words and put them together, you simply have the word Philadelphia, which literally means brotherly love. And so that's why, the city of Philadelphia that's located here in the United States, in Pennsylvania, we call it the city of brotherly love because that's what the word means, and that was the name of this church. And in fact, King Eumenes II built this city and named it in commemoration of his younger brother. And so Philadelphia was located, if you look at the map, it was located on the most eastern border of the province of Asia, about 28 miles southeast of Sardis. And it's interesting in its location because the city stood where three other provinces actually came together, and it bordered these three provinces. That's the province of Mysia, Lydia, and Phrygia. Those three provinces all bordered down together right at the city of Philadelphia. And so, because of that, the city of Philadelphia, you ready for this? In ancient times was known as the gateway to the east. Sound familiar? You all know where you live? Okay. Right? So we're used to St. Louis being the city that's the gateway to the west, right? So, I always thought about this. They built the arch there, and so, the gateway, is that the actual gateway to the west? Is through the arch? They should have made the highway right through the middle of the arch. That would have been cool, wouldn't it? But here in St. Louis, right, we're the gateway to the west. Well, Philadelphia was the gateway to the east. And because of its location, it became very strategic for commerce and trade, as you can imagine. And the city was located on one of the greatest trade routes in the world that linked Europe to Asia. In fact, if you took that road through Philadelphia and continued east, you would eventually end up in Assyria. That's where it would lead you to. And so, it's interesting because the city of Philadelphia was literally, in its day and time, the open door through which all commerce passed into the eastern lands. Okay? Keep that in mind. Philadelphia was the city or the gateway to the east, and it was the open door where everything passed into the eastern lands. Now, after succeeding his brother in 159 BC, King Attalus designed the city of Philadelphia just for commerce, and he also made it a missionary city, so to speak, by exporting Greek culture and the Greek language to the surrounding areas. Okay? So 300 or so BC, it was Alexander the Great, whenever he conquered the world, what he did is he Hellenized the world. The word Hellenize literally means to Greekize, okay? It was Alexander the Great who really brought the world together and really set the world up for Rome to be the great empire it was. And so it was under the conquering of the world and the known world at that time, the area there in the east by Alexander the Great. What he did is he brought the world together as one in the sense that the world had one main language, and that was Greek. He was all about Hellenizing the world, making the world that he conquered just like him and his people, the Greeks. And so Alexander the Great was very much about promoting the Greek language, Greek customs, their way of life. I mean, if you're going to conquer the world, the easiest way to control it then and to manage it is to bring everybody, under submission to your language, your culture, and the way you live. Now, this is interesting because this is why when you come to the New Testament and you read, for instance, in Acts chapter 6, after the church was born and the church was growing exponentially with people, that in Acts chapter 6, it tells us about this problem where among the Jews, among those who were Jewish, and they were believers in Jesus Christ, they were part of the church, and you all do know this, right? That at the beginning, in the book of Acts, the church was Jewish. It wasn't Gentile. There were no Gentiles in the church at this time. And in Acts chapter 6, what happened was, it says there was a dispute that came up between the widows who were Jewish, between the Hebrew widows and the Hellenized or Hellenist or Greek widows. In other words, it was the Greek widows who were complaining to the apostles that we're not getting free treatment in the church because we're not Jewish. So we're not getting all the bread we're supposed to be getting and all the assistance and money and things that we need as Greek widows that the Hebrew widows are getting because they're Jewish. And so in Acts chapter 6, when it talks about these Hellenistic Jews or these Hellenistic widows, these were Jewish women who were widows, but the fact they were Hellenists means they were Greek speakers. Okay? They spoke Greek. In fact, even in the time of the early church, the universal language of the known world was what they call Koine, which means common, Koine Greek. Okay? In fact, by the time we get to the New Testament times, the Old Testament had already been translated by 70 scholars in Alexandria, Egypt. 70 Jewish scholars in Alexandria, Egypt. They had taken the Old Testament and they had translated it into Greek so that, those who spoke Greek could understand the Hebrew scriptures. So honestly, about the time the church comes on the scene and we come to the New Testament period, really the only people who are speaking Hebrew are the rabbis and those who are reading from the Hebrew scrolls in the synagogues. That's how good of a job Alexander the Great did when he conquered the world and he Hellenized it. He did such a good job that even most Jews during New Testament times spoke Greek and not even spoke Hebrew as a regular language. Okay, so that's the impact of that. And so that's the importance of this whole idea of King Attalus there in Philadelphia, using Philadelphia as a missionary outpost to the rest of the world to bring the Greek culture and the Greek language to everyone else. in the East. And so, it tells us, history tells us that Philadelphia, because of that, was literally the open door into the rest of Asia Minor. Okay? So you could say it this way, that what King Attalus was doing is he was preaching his gospel, and he was using Philadelphia as the missionary headquarters to get the Greek culture out to the rest of the Eastern world. Okay? Now that's interesting because I want you to look here in Revelation 3, and I want you to look at verses 7 and 8. And I want you to look at the language that Jesus uses when he speaks to his church here in Philadelphia about spiritual things. Notice it says, he says, "Write these things, says he who is holy, he who is true." Okay, now again, we know this, right, from the rest of the letters. Here's Jesus, again, giving a clear description of himself to the church that comes from chapter 1. We'll deal with that next Wednesday. But look what he says now. He says, he, speaking of himself, he who has the key of David, he who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens. Verse 8, he says, "I know your works." So there's the confession he makes to the church. He knows what's going on in their church. But notice what he says here. He says, "See, I have set before you an open door, and no one can shut it." You see that? It was the reason Jesus is using this verbiage is because the city of Philadelphia, okay, was a cultural missionary outpost for the Greek language and for the Greek culture. And Jesus is saying, hey, just as King Attalus has used this place to get Greek culture and Greek language out to the rest of the world, you know what? You're here for a purpose. Jesus says, I'm the one with the keys that opens things and that locks things. And he says, and I have set before you, because of your location, because of where your church is at, I've set before you an open door that no man can shut. Now, we'll get into this again next week a little deeper, but when he talks about it, giving them an open door, he's talking about he has given this church specific and very special opportunities to get the gospel out to the rest of the world that some of these other churches don't have, simply because of where they're located. See? And we see the same thing today with churches. The fact that our church, okay, and trust me, I'll be the first to admit, it has its pros and it has its cons. But the fact that our church is located in downtown Festus, on Main Street, gives our church special opportunities of outreach to minister to our community, okay, that other churches who are in Festus, but maybe they're in the county, maybe they're in the rural areas, they don't have the same opportunities we have simply because of our location, okay? So this is the kind of thing that was going on with the Church of Philadelphia. And that's why Jesus says what he says here in verses 7 and 8. So just as the city of Philadelphia had an open door into other regions, the church in Philadelphia had an open door to take the message of Jesus into the surrounding areas as well. All right? Now, with that said, I want to touch on this for just a moment. Don't want to belabor it, but I think this is a good time to mention this point. That again, when we look at the 7 letters to the 7 churches, we see a panoramic view of church history from its beginning in the first century even till today. As you look at these churches in order, there seems to be a prophetic layout of church history. And so just as the church at Sardis represented the time of church history and the era of church history of the Protestant Reformation, okay, between the 1500s and about 1500 or so to 1750, this church now, the next church, would cover now the next era or the next period of church history, which would be the era of the missionary church, when the church, after the Protestant Reformation, all over the world, okay, especially here in America, begin to send missionaries out to all over the world, of which we're still doing, okay? And so what's interesting, in church history, this church, the faithful church of Philadelphia, represents the church that of the missionary era from 1750 even up to the present time, okay? So when we're looking at this issue of church history as it's laid out here in Revelation 2 and 3, this is the time period we're speaking of, okay? And again, it's perfect because it follows right after the church of Sardis, which talks about the Protestant Reformation, and then most of those churches that came out of that, or those denominations that came out of that, became dead orthodoxy. Then there was this revival of such to where now the church, especially here in America, began to send missionaries all over the world. And that's seen in what Jesus says to the church of Philadelphia. Does that make sense? So it's very, very interesting, okay? Now, Philadelphia was such a center of Greek culture and refinement that it was actually referred to by the Greek historian Strabo as the Little Athens, okay? And when we speak of Athens, we're speaking of Athens, Greece. Athens, Greece was, again, a headquarter for Greek culture and especially Greek philosophy. And so Philadelphia was so Hellenized, and one of the centers of Hellenization, that Strabo actually called it Little Athens. Now, the city of Philadelphia was so rich in magnificent temples and other public buildings, such as it had a huge stadium, and it also had a theater, like a lot of the larger metropolitan ancient cities, such as Ephesus, that we've already studied. But what's interesting is this. Because of its rich volcanic soil, Philadelphia was surrounded by vineyards, making wine and grapes their actual agricultural business, okay? So because of the volcanic action around them, their soil was so rich that the city of Philadelphia had this great valley where it was just full of vineyards, and they grew very well because of the rich soil. And so this is why the city of Philadelphia was dedicated to the Greek god Dionysus, okay? He has a Roman name you may have heard of. The Roman version of Dionysus is Bacchus. Dionysus or Bacchus was the supposed god of wine. And because he was the god of wine, he became the god of debauchery. Okay? Because when people drink too much wine, okay, that's the way they live. That's the things they do. And so Bacchus or Dionysus actually became known as the god of revelry, the god of drunkenness, the god of party and orgies and things like that. You know what happens to people when they drink too much alcohol and they lose control? Yeah, Dionysus was the god of all that. And much of that was centered in the city of Philadelphia. Now, because Philadelphia was surrounded by so much volcanic activity, and because it sit on a major fault system that run through the area, this city and the surrounding cities, like Sardis, which we've already talked about, was subject to a lot of major earthquakes. Okay? If you remember when we first began our study of the church at Sardis, I talked about the city of Sardis, and we talked about the earthquakes that they experienced. Well, Philadelphia was right there in that same area, and they experienced it too. In fact, just like the city of Sardis, there was so much volcanic activity in this area that in the year 17 AD, this city, as well as Sardis, and actually Sardis got hit worse with this earthquake, but there was a earthquake that just devastated the area, including this city. The earthquake was so bad that the Roman Emperor Tiberius actually exempted the city of Philadelphia from taxes for 5 whole years. The emperor said, you guys don't have to pay taxes for 5 years because you got a lot of rebuilding to do. And Tiberius also, to help them recover, not only exempt them from taxes, but he also provided some relief himself, but not near enough relief they needed to rebuild. And so what would happen is the local people then, in order to rebuild their city, were being taxed again in order to get the money they needed to build the city. So the people were being taxed. And as a result, most of the people who lived in the city of Philadelphia at that time actually became very poor because they were required to pay such hefty taxes to help rebuild the city. So it's like, well, thank you, government, for your promises to help, and they didn't help them like they should have or they needed to. And so, again, in order to try to raise money, they taxed themselves to death and they ended up poor. And then later, now this is important, I want you to understand this. Later, it would be the Roman Emperor Domitian. You ever heard that name? I hope you remember that name because we've used that name in our studies here in Revelation before. This is the emperor who banished John the Apostle to the island of Patmos, where he received this revelation from Jesus. It's that emperor, okay? So Domitian, what he did, he actually came along and he demanded that all of the vineyards in and around Philadelphia, he demanded that they be pulled up and they be torn out so that Rome, the city of Rome, his capital, his hometown, would actually be the leading producer and the leading exporter of wine and grapes in the Roman Empire. Philadelphia was beating him. So he's like, hey, destroy all your vineyards, not caring how it was going to affect the people. And the effect is that it literally crippled the backbone of Philadelphia's economy. So the Roman government, didn't do a whole lot to help this poor city rebuild and recover. Now, they did rebuild and recover, but they ended up poor and they ended up with a very crippled economy. And with that, I want you to look down with me here at verse 8. And I want you to notice something that Jesus says to this church because of the fact that this church is located in this city. This church was affected by all this. Do you realize that, right? That when our economy is affected, our church is affected. If so many of you lose your jobs, or inflation goes so high that you have to pay more for the services and goods that you need for you and your family. It's sad to say, but you know what? A lot of times, what is one of the first things that get cut out of our budgets? It's what we give to the church. Our church has been tremendously blessed. We have through the years and have to this day. In fact, during COVID, in 2020, during COVID when we were not meeting, and then we began to meet and we were meeting in smaller groups and we were meeting less, through 2020, this church took in more money than it ever did in its history. That's amazing. That is amazing, isn't it? When we weren't even meeting. And then when we did meet, we were just like, only some of you can come because we got a social distance. You know what I'm saying? And then by the time we get back into full swing of things, by the time that year is over, we had received more money in that year than we had in any year in our church. It was because God took care of us. And guys, listen, he took care of us through you. Okay? This church is not mine. I don't own it. I didn't buy it. Jesus did. This church, like every other church that's a true church, belongs to Jesus. And he will take care of it and he will provide for it. Okay? He promises to do that. But what we have to understand as Christians is, as faithful Christians, Jesus uses us as the pipeline to get to the church what it needs to do ministry. Okay? So the fact that the city of Philadelphia was affected economically in such a drastic way meant it had an effect on the church too, just like it does today. You know, and as your pastor, listen, I thank God for every one of you that during COVID, when money was tight, the future was unsure, and even to this day, you know, some of you may have had changes in your job or in your employment or in your income or whatever, but I just thank God for every single one of you who faithfully support this church financially. Because if we don't all, and I'll be the first to tell you, you know, me and my family, we give to this church, okay? And we give faithfully, and we give as much as we possibly can, okay? We don't just go by, you know, the rule of 10%. As God blesses us, we give more, and we bless. And we all should, as the Lord blesses us. That's one of the principles of giving. I don't know if you know this or not, but in the New Testament, the principle of giving is not tithing. That's Old Testament. The principle of giving in the New Testament is we are to give as the Lord has prospered us. So if you're having a hard financial time and you don't have that much money, well, then don't worry about trying to give so much if you're in need. Take care of yourself, take care of your family, because those of you who can't give as much right now, there's other people in the church who are doing very well and should be giving even more because they've been blessed. You see how that works? So in the New Testament, when it comes to giving, there isn't anywhere, study it, you'll find out, there isn't anywhere that says, well, as a Christian, I'm supposed to give 10% of my income if I'm a good Christian. It doesn't say that. It teaches giving, not paying tithes. That's Old Testament. And in fact, maybe for some of you who maybe think, you know, well, I'm a tither, I give 10% of my income. You know how pharisaical that sounds? And here's what I want to say. If you're going to tithe, then you should do it biblically. And do you realize that Israel in the Old Testament, when they tithed, there was actually 2 tithes they gave every year. And then every 3rd year, they were to give another tithe on top of the 2 they were already giving. So the Jews were required by their law, when they tithed, to give 23.33% of their income every year. So for those of you who are like, you're proud of yourself, because I give 10%, well, if you're going to be biblical, you better bump it up to 23.33. Boy, that's tough, isn't it? You see why we don't want to live by the law? Let's leave that there. What's the New Testament teach? Here's what the New Testament teaches. If God has blessed you with lot, then give a lot. If he's blessed you with little, then let the pressure be taken off and give what you can to honor your Lord. Okay? So when it comes to giving, guys, this is why here at Calvary Chapel, this is why, and some Calvary Chapels do, but we don't here. That's why we don't pass a plate. Have you ever noticed when you come to this church, there's not a part in our worship service where, you know, we're playing music or, you know, there's a special song and then the ushers walk down the aisles and put a plate in your face for you to give money. We don't do that here because we don't want to make money an issue here. That's why we have a box back there for you to give, okay, to the Lord. It's between you and him, okay? That's why we have the box, because we don't want to make it an issue. We don't want to make money an issue where it doesn't need to be an issue. I don't want unbelievers coming to this church, you know, and coming into our time of worship, and they're in this environment, and then all of a sudden somebody stands up and says, now it's time to give. You know, so dig deep. Do your best. Here's the needs we have. You know, it's time to make your pledge. You know, we need money for the building fund, which, by the way, we do need money for the building fund. But we don't get up here and harp about we need money for the building fund. We do have a building fund, by the way, that we're taking from the general fund, and we're putting a certain amount each month into a building fund slowly so that we can eventually move out of this small building. But that's why we don't do that here, because I don't want unbelievers, or I don't want Christians who have been burned by money-hungry preachers and pastors and churches trying to squeeze a dime out of everybody. I don't want that experience to happen at this church. So that's why we don't pass the plate. I'm not condemning churches to do pass the plate. Some Calvary chapels pass the plate. I don't have a problem. Well, I think it's more like a bag now they use, isn't it? They pass the bag. But for our church, and when we started this church, the Calvary chapel I came from gave the way we gave. They just had a box in the back, and that's what we gave to. And I had come out of a hyper-charismatic church that not only expected you to give your 10%, but they expect you to give to the building fund, and they expect you to give extra money in the winter because they had the heating bill, and extra money in the summer because now they had the air conditioning bill, and we had church 3 times a week, and they believed that every time you come to church, you should give an offering every time. And I tell you what, it just sucked the life out of you. And when I left that church, I swore, when I become a pastor, I'm not going to do that to people. And the Calvary Chapel I went to didn't do that. Never mentioned money, except for when they're teaching the Bible. And I loved that. And that was the commitment that I was going to make when I became a pastor. And that's what we've done. Okay? And if you notice, the only time we ask you for money is when it's for somebody else, basically. It's, hey, Kogo for Christ. We want you to give money to them so they can get the stuff for the duffel bags to bless foster children. That's not for us. It's for them. Hey, every month. Hey, don't bring in these items for OCC so we can put these boxes together. Why? Not to give to your kids, but to give the kids all over the world who need to hear the gospel. It's for somebody else. You know what I'm saying? Every time we're asking you for something, it's for somebody else. And that I don't care to do. And 2, just in case you're wondering, as the pastor of the church, and the board can verify this, I do not, I never have, and I don't to this day, I do not see who gives what in this church. If you give to this church, I don't know it, and I don't know how much. And don't tell me, because I don't want to know. Okay? I want to make sure that I'm not tempted to give special treatment to people in this church just because they give a lot of money, or not serve them like I should because they don't give anything. See? And there's pastors that do that because pastors are human. And it is very tempting to give special treatment to members of the church who either give a lot of money to the church or do a lot for the church. And I never want to be guilty of that. So that's why we give the way we give. Okay? So, the Church of Philadelphia, these words their history is important because of what Jesus is going to say to them. They were in an economy that was hard and it was tough. And look what Jesus says to them in verse 8. This is why he says this. Look at verse 8. Look in the middle of the verse. I already read for you the first part of the verse, right? About the open door. You have an opportunity of ministry because of where you're located. Get the gospel out. Then he says, for you have a little strength. This is amazing, isn't it? Out of all the 7 churches, this is the faithful church. Okay? Smyrna was a faithful church too, and they were the persecuted church. But this was the church that was faithful in doing what Jesus told them to do. But how does Jesus describe them? You have little strength. Okay? Why did they have little strength? Because of where they were located in Philadelphia. They were being affected by what was going on around them, just like every church to this day is. Okay? So, that's important to make note of. Now, after that earthquake, after 17 AD, recurrent earthquakes occurred in this region for 20 more years. It was just like earthquake after earthquake after earthquake for 20 years. And what happened was, it actually terrified the residents of Philadelphia. And so even after the city was rebuilt, at the order of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, the people were actually afraid to live within the city limits. The people were afraid to live within the city walls, so you know what they did for safety? They all moved out of town. They all moved into burbs. We got to get out of here. Actually, they moved in the country. Certain historical accounts I read said that some of them, what they did is they just built little homes out in the country. So that way, when the next earthquake comes, they're not living around all those magnificent buildings and those walls that surround the city, because they were afraid that if another earthquake came, they lived in the city, it was all going to fall on them. They're going to die. So they were building little homes and even living in tents. Okay, not in tents, but in tents. Camping, so to speak, out in the country where they were supposed to have the vineyards growing. They were out there living out there. They were afraid to live within the city walls. And so for safety, they went outside the city. And I bring that up because if you would, look with me at verse 10. At verse 10, Jesus makes a promise to them. Now keep this in mind. Most of the people have moved outside the city because they were afraid for the next earthquake coming. But Jesus makes this church a promise. He says, because you have kept my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial which shall come upon the whole earth to test those who dwell on the earth. What's he talking about here? Is Jesus talking about he's going to keep them from the next earthquake that's coming? No. When he talks about the hour of trial which will come upon the whole world, he's talking about the tribulation period. He's talking about the future. And he's like, you know what? It's the faithful church, as we talked about Sunday. It's the faithful believers who are going to escape the tribulation because they're going to go into rapture. And he makes a promise to this faithful church, because you've persevered. He says, I'm going to keep you from the hour of trial that's going to come up on the whole world. That's the tribulation. Now here's what's interesting. What's one of the things that's going to happen in the tribulation? Earthquakes. In fact, Matthew 24, speaking of the tribulation and the sign, one of the signs of Jesus' second coming is what? There's going to be an increase in earthquakes, which of course we've been seeing for years and years and years in our world, okay, since Jesus spoke this. But boy, the catastrophes that are going to happen, the natural disasters and the catastrophes that are going to happen, like earthquakes and hail that's 120-pound hailstones falling from the sky, you know, I mean, all the crazy stuff is going to be happening on the earth. Jesus tells this church, who's living outside the city limits because they're afraid of the next earthquake, listen, there's going to be a greater earthquake than that coming, but because you persevered, I'm going to keep you from it. Wow, isn't that awesome? Guys, that's the promise we have. That's a promise Jesus made the Church of Philadelphia. Again, okay, which very well in church history could be speaking of the time we're in right now. But the point is this, Jesus makes a promise to his church. You weren't appointed for the wrath of God. When the tribulation comes, that is going to be the wrath of God up on an unbelieving world. And he's like, I'm going to keep you from that. That's a blessing, guys. Okay? So that's what he tells them here. Now, also, if you would, come down to verse 12. In verse 12, he's speaking to the overcomers, okay, in the church. And look what he says to them here. I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. Do you see that? A pillar in the temple of my God. Now, when you think of a pillar, think of ancient times when these temples were huge and they were made of stone. Now, think about the pillars of these temples. If you've ever seen pictures of, or if you've ever been anywhere where there's ruins of ancient temples, and you see these pillars, they're massive. They're massive. Now, they weren't totally indestructible because we're looking at the ruins of them, but they're massive. In other words, Jesus is saying to them, you know, listen, I'm aware of what's going on in the topography of your land and the geography of your land. I get you have a lot of earthquakes, but he promises them, guess what? You're going to be as stable and strong as a pillar. See, I like that. Again, he makes this promise to them that they're going to be strong. They're going to be stable. And look what else he says. He says, and he shall go out no more. And I will write on him the name of my God. And get this, and the name of the city of my God. What's the city of Jesus' God, the Father? What's the city? He says, the New Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God. He's telling these faithful believers that guess what? You're citizens of a city, the New Jerusalem, like we talked about Sunday, right? If you're a born-again believer, your name is written down on the registry, right, of God's city, the New Jerusalem. Revelation chapter 21 speaks of this New Jerusalem. And it says this very thing, that the New Jerusalem is going to come down from heaven, down to the earth. And that's where we're going to live for eternity. We are not as believers going to live in heaven as we know it now for eternity. We're going to live in the New Jerusalem, which will be upon a new earth here. This earth will be renovated, renewed, made new, and the New Jerusalem will be part of that renovation. And that's where we will live for eternity. Okay? So think about this. He's speaking to a church who are all living in the suburbs and in the country because they're afraid to live within the city walls in case there's another earthquake. Okay? So his promise to them is, listen, don't worry about it. One day, guess what? The New Jerusalem's going to come down out of heaven, and you're going to live there with me. And that promises to all of us as believers. See? So I hope I'm not belaboring you with all this history, but do you see how the history of this city connects with what Jesus says? Every one of these letters are this way. And some are a little more pronounced than others, but the history of these cities have everything to do with what Jesus actually says to the church spiritually. Okay? And finally, let's wind things down. Philadelphia, after this time period, Philadelphia actually remained a Roman city until 1379. And that's when it was seized by the Turks. And today, if you go to Philadelphia, it's actually a Turkish city. And the city is actually built on top of the ruins and the remains of the ancient city of Philadelphia. Okay? So I've never been to Philadelphia. I would love to go on a Footsteps of Paul tour and go to Turkey and see these cities. I've seen them in video. I've seen them in pictures. I've not yet went to Philadelphia. But everything that I have read and seen, it's interesting because today Philadelphia is this modern city, and you just have a few remains to actually go see in that city because the modern city is actually built on top of the old one. So in order to excavate and to be able to dig down to see what ruins are there, you're going to have to kick people out of the city. And they're not too crazy about doing that. So anyhow. So today, the city of Philadelphia is called, let me see if I can get this name right. It's Alaşehir. Alaşehir is the name of the city today in Turkey that sits on top of ancient Philadelphia. And what's interesting is that name, Alaşehir, actually means Red City. And it's called Red City because of its volcanic dirt, because the soil, is volcanic soil. And to this day, it has that name. Now, the only things that really, if you go to Philadelphia today, that there are really to see there are the remnants of a stadium that they once had, the remnants of a theater, some of the parts of the city walls. But there's something else you can see there. And what you can see there are these massive pillars. That's interesting. Do we have the picture of it? We have a picture of it. Let's put that up. Look at these pillars. This is the city of Philadelphia. This is some of the grandest remains to see there. And these are actually massive pillars from a Byzantine church that was built around 600 AD. And guess what the name of this church is? Or was? St. John's Church. It was named after John the Apostle, who was given the book of Revelation, which mentions the city of Philadelphia. Isn't that interesting? Now, if you would again, look at come down with me, and look at, again, verse 12, right? What's Jesus say to him who overcomes? I will make him a what? A pillar in the temple of my God. So after all the history and everything that went on after they built this church, look what remains. These huge pillars. And Jesus says, this is what you as a faithful believer are going to be. I'm going to keep you from the hour of trial and tribulations coming upon the world. And when everything is rocking and reeling and shaking in this world, you're going to stand firm. Isn't that awesome? Man, what a wonderful promise. We just basically did a little overview there of the whole letter. So next Wednesday, we'll pick up in verse 1, and we'll start with the clear description of Jesus to the church, and we'll break this down verse by verse as we go through it. And my goal will be, tonight was part 1, so my goal will be to finish this in less than 12 messages.